The novel that I chose to do for this project is a memoir called Uncultured, written by Daniella Mestyanek Young. This family that I have chosen that does not demand that I be anything or anyone other than who I am is where I can be my fullest self. This family in which I am free. This is the last line in the epilogue of the book, and I think it's really representative of her finding solace among the strife, and that really the best revenge is a life well lived. I think it's a really well-written memoir, and it uses a lot of descriptive language and imagery, particularly around the setting. This book is set mostly in Brazil, although we do later move to America, and I think the descriptions around her life and experiences in the cult and in Brazil are incredibly important, because I think that the general audience of who's going to be reading this book might not have context for that. There's also allusion to the Bible and a lot of cult literature. It's written in a first-person subjective style, as it is a memoir, and it uses a lot of descriptive, vivid language to bring you into the story. Daniella talks about, on her other platforms like her Patreon and her TikTok, who she wanted to write this book for and why she wrote this book, and some of the big reasons for that are to help cult survivors perhaps deconstruct their own indoctrination and upbringing, and to connect with vets and help them describe and relay their experiences. And then the adult general public, I think, could also benefit from reading this book, although, again, there is some kind of heavier subject material, so I would definitely advise discretion on your part. A summary of some of the things that we talk about are internal conflict and resilience. I think this is a really reflective and provocative novel, and it does encourage you to think a lot about, even if perhaps not maybe your own cult experiences, maybe, the world around you. I definitely think it encourages you to think deeper. It's also explores a lot of heavy, dark, and emotional things, and I do think that listening to this as an audiobook really adds an additional layer to that. I think it's kind of unjust to call Daniella anything other than a dynamic, round character, because she is a real person. And also throughout the book, she goes from being a very shy, insecure, vulnerable child who's not really being taken care of by the adults in her life, to this secure, confident, smart, intelligent, well-read adult. We deal with a lot of issues on conformity, identity, and insecurity. And then I'm also going to give a trigger warning, because there are descriptions of assault, sexual assault, child sexual assault, rape, and then we also touch on addiction a little bit. This is Daniella Mestyanek Young, as she describes herself: scholar of cults, extreme groups, and extremely bad leadership. That is pulled from either the opening line or the outro of every TikTok she makes. She is a survivor who was born into the Children of God religious cult. She moved around the world to different communes and left and graduated high school in the U.S. She joined the army with who is her now ex-husband and built up an incredibly impressive resume. This is her first book, but she does have other works in progress, particularly Un-American as a follow-up to this book. She is a public speaker and a content creator who also does podcasts, TikTok. I mentioned before she has a Patreon. She does a lot of veteran advocacy, and then she speaks multiple languages. She speaks Portuguese, Spanish, and English, and then she was one of the first women ever on a deliberate ground combat team in U.S. Army history. So I'm going to give a brief description of the cult that she was raised into, and I do just want to give a little graphic content warning here. There is talk about child abuse. She was born into the Children of God, which is now known as the Family International, which began with David Berg in 1958. He used the counterculture movement to recruit young, vulnerable women to his idea of worship, and then they were sort of colloquially referred to as the Teens for Jesus. It started off as a really puritanical sect with no drugs, no alcohol, no premarital sex, but particularly premarital sex became really commonplace and honestly expected behavior of members of the cult. He began to have revelations, and a lot of these had to do with ideas around sex, and he changed his name to Moses David to sound more prophet-like. New members were forced to forsake their old lives and connections to their friends, their families, their jobs, and then the international communes really helped with that isolation. Daniella talks about when adults are bad or misbehave or outspoken in the cult, they tend to get moved to other communes. David Berg had a revelation of something called the law of love, which he used to justify behaviors, particularly around pedophilia, and sex became synonymous with the children of God. It's often referred to as the child sex cult. He taught my grandparents' generation, the first generation, that it was their sacred duty to raise sexually liberated children, and publicly declared how he'd wished he'd been liberated enough to have sex with his own mother as a young teenager. So this shows us that Berg really had a heavy Oedipus complex, which probably played a really strong role into the way that he taught his followers, and is probably also an underlying sign of some severe mental illness that contributed to the development of the cult. So Daniella's cult life, this is the title of the first chapter of the book, called Spare the Rod, Spoil the Child. And honestly, this first chapter is really, really jarring. We start right off the bat with descriptions of essentially a spanking line, and the youngest children go last, and that's punishment was used as a spectacle to make an example of bad children, and public humiliation was a big part of that. Like, if you were caught crying or anything like that, you would be beaten worse. There's a lot of heavy brainwashing and indoctrination through this abuse, and one of the last things Daniella says in the first chapter of the book is that she can't remember a single day of her childhood that she wasn't hit, and hit hard, which really made me upset, but quite honestly, it just gets worse throughout the entire novel. We start to see the cracks in the brainwashing that Daniella experiences, and this sort of happens, of course, in her teenage years. Chapter 13 begins with 9/11, and she's experiencing the adults sort of rejoicing in the events that they're witnessing. And she starts to kind of get this idea of, what could these people have possibly done to have deserved such righteous damnation? And we then move into chapter 14, which is called Not Fit for the Kingdom of God. And this is where Daniella really starts to just be done with it. She wants out. The cult has this extreme control over its members, where they're not entitled to privacy, they're not allowed to be alone. They're essentially required to be accountable to somebody at all times. And so her desire for freedom eventually overcomes her fear of what might happen if she leaves, and she leaves. She finished high school in the U.S. and attended UT Dallas. She then transitioned into the Army, and she spent as much time as she possibly could gaining knowledge. College encouraged her to learn and think. She joined chess club in college because she searched for community, and then eventually met a man who wanted to join the Army, which led her to a sort of deep sense of patriotism. Army life, for her, she describes as knowing how to operate when she's dependent and trapped, and that's really how she describes feeling through a lot of this section of the book. She's assaulted and raped multiple times throughout her time in boot camp. And And then when she gets out, she has her heart set on becoming a military intelligence officer because she really does want to know everything, because information was kept from her entire life. So she goes on to specialize in military intelligence, Captain Mestyanek Young, part of the 104th Airborne Division and the 159th Combat Aviation Brigade. She goes on to sort of parallel her experiences a little bit with the cult in the us versus them mentality. There is a chapter called Us versus Them, and it really gives her this deep sense of the divides that she's going to experience with men versus women, and then later Americans versus the Afghanis. She does go on 2 deployments to Afghanistan, and sort of in that she proves that women were integral to mission success. Of course, the army comes with a lot of baggage. She lost a lot of weight and developed more severe body issues. She lost a sense of personal identity through this, and then of course the military is synonymous with PTSD and trauma. She touches on it only really briefly in this book, but throughout her TikTok and some of her other content, she does talk about her experiences with alcoholism and AA. Now, she is known as Knitting Cult Lady on most of her platforms. If you search Knitting Cult Lady, you will find her TikTok first, followed by generally the rest of the stuff that she's involved with. She has a beautiful daughter, and she talks about being very determined to give her a safe and happy childhood, healing her self-image and her confidence. And then she likes to vacation in places that bring her closer to home, as well as healing trauma and family bonds. She is a scholar of cults and extreme leadership. She focuses on education, outreach, and advocacy. And I'm going to leave you with the thing that no one tells you about the shepherd analogy is that shepherds always eat their sheep in the end. Cult leaders shepherd their followers towards their destruction or even their own death if they can't crack the brainwashing, and Daniella broke her chains and found probably the most fulfilling life that she could have possibly found, despite all of the experiences that she goes through. She also comes up with a list of 10 characteristics from a cult, which, while are not technically the most relevant thing, I do want to include here, because it is a culmination of her education, her experience, and a lot of these things are discussed. For example, charismatic leadership in Children of God being David Berg. It's important to mention that it can also be led by an idea such as sobriety or the U.S. Constitution, the shift of worldview, a transcendent mission, particularly self-sacrifice, distinguishable vernacular. Isolation and the us versus them thing are huge with both the Children of God, the military, and other cults. And then high entrance and exit costs. Essentially, if you have to decide between losing nothing or having nothing, that is really where that becomes that line. And these are the main sources that I used for this. Most of my information came straight out of her book. I sorted one particular TikTok here for the list of the 10 things, but it's in every single one of her TikToks. And then also, there's a really good documentary about the Children of God on YouTube, and that's where I got some of that supplemental information. Thank you so much.